Welcome to Heart Talk, coming to you live from Kota Kinabalu in Sabah, in Malaysia. Heart Talk is all about real life issues, engaging with them on a heart-to-heart concept of really going deep into the real issues of life concerning health, wellness, and spiritual living. And I'm delighted today that we can touch on all three aspects of Heart Talk. And with me today is Dr. Irene Kraegel, who is the, I've got it here, Director of the Center for Counseling and Wellness at Calvin University. She's a clinical psychologist by training, licensed and ready to get the world in order. And she's also the author of a book that is making waves across the world, and that is The Mindful Christian. So without further ado, I want to welcome Irene. Can I call you Irene?
Yes, please do. And thank you for having me here. I'm so happy to have this opportunity.
It's a pleasure, Irene. And I can tell you one thing off the bat. I've been looking for you. Hey, tell us something about yourself before I start. So, because you got a suitcase of credentials, and so briefly tell us, for those who are listening into Heart Talk, tell me something about yourself before I go dive into areas that I feel are just fantastic, and I'm waiting to hear your side of it. So talk to me.
Well, sure. I always say my main credential is that I'm a human being, and that's why I care about this topic of mindfulness. That's why I care about Christian faith and blending these two things together. I've had my own journey with mental health, both professionally and personally, and I feel really passionately about sharing as many tools as possible for all of us as we deal with some of the challenges of managing our minds. Personally, I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is in the United States. I have a husband of almost 22 years, a son who's 10 years old, and we all have various interests. My husband does children's book writing and illustrating.
Nice.
My son is an avid reader, so we're all kind of into books in our house. Yeah, we really enjoy living in Michigan. Lots of snow here, lots of cold weather in the winter months, but that keeps us awake and energized. So I've lived in lots of places through my life. So I here in the college and university context, sometimes students talk about the third culture kid experience of moving a lot in different cultures and different places. My moving experiences have been primarily within the US throughout my life, but lots of differences in cultures within the states that I've experienced and grown up in. So I think that's been a defining characteristic of my life so far. And I'm really grateful for all those different cross-cultural experiences, both in the States and outside of the States as well. And I really feel passionately about bringing mindfulness, particularly to people who might have concerns about it based on Christian faith, or that belief that maybe faith and mindfulness can't be compatible with one another. So that's really a passion area of mine.
What led you to clinical psychology? Could have been organization, could be anything else.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a roundabout journey to get there. When I was in university, I had no thought of being in psychology whatsoever. It didn't cross my mind. I was a sociology major, so I was in the general social sciences area. But it was really after I graduated and started working in the field of international development that I realized I was really looking for a field where I could have sort of a one-on-one personal connection with people in some kind of a helping capacity. I knew that I wanted to be present for people in challenging times to be able to help bring some resolution for folks. And so I always tell the students I work with on a college campus here that there was kind of a process I went through after college of really sitting down and saying, what am I good at? What do I like to do? Sort of very systematically listing these things out. And I realized at that point, after I had already graduated from university and tried out some other things, that really clinical psychology was that right fit for my interests and skills. So at that point, I went back to do some prerequisite classes that I needed to do to be able to go into graduate school for clinical psychology. And yeah, I have not regretted it since. It's really been a fulfilling journey. It's evolved a bit in terms of how I've practiced it over the years. I didn't really know anything about mindfulness when I started as a psychologist, and I certainly didn't have higher education on my radar in terms of the context that I might serve in the future. But I've really found it to be both of those areas to be really rewarding.
And now I want to go zero in right on to what made you write the book, The Mindful Christian.
Well, I wrote it because there didn't seem to be anything out there at the time for Christians who are interested in mindfulness. I had actually started the work with a website that I kicked off back in 2013, 2014. And at that time, there were really just alarmist types of messages online regarding mindfulness and Christian faith. And they really didn't seem grounded in truth to me based on my own experiences, both with my deep Christian faith and my practice of mindfulness, which seemed to be fitting together very well for me. And so when I went online and saw people with concerns about mindfulness based on spiritual reasons, I thought I would love to get some more accurate information out there about what mindfulness is and make sure that Christians know that this is an accessible tool for everybody to use, even within the context of Christian faith. So I had started that website, done some blogging there. I've been teaching mindfulness as integrated with Christian faith for quite a while at the campus of Calvin University. And out of that work, there arose this opportunity to write a book. And that's really been a treat, as it's opened me up to lots of different conversations with other people around the world about this topic as well. But it really stems from my own experiences with mindfulness through a Christian lens and my desire to make sure that Christians know that it's an available tool for physical and mental and spiritual wellness.
So it's a tool.
Mm-hmm. It's a tool, yeah. Yeah, and I always emphasize it's a tool, so I think when we get excited about things, there can be a tendency to think it's the end all be all. And mindfulness is not the end all be all. It's not really, Jesus is the only end all be all, right? And mindfulness is a wonderful tool for wellness along the way. I believe it's a God-given tool, just learning to pay attention, just like other tools of physical and mental wellness. But I found it to be a very powerful tool.
I like that, what I'm hearing, because you have zeroed in and focused yourself on something that is that can be tangible, that's something that can be used. Because when you think of the mind, it's something that is just floating out there. I remember asking another clinical psychologist, is the mind the center of the whole of life? And she said, that's a very good question, because you really do not know where it is. It's not in a place like you can say, okay, this is the hypothalamus, or this is the this is the frontal cortex. It's just out there. And you can't put a place to it where it's hiding, But I want to just go in deeper with you. How important, Irene, for you as a clinical psychologist, and you're trained, to have known yourself first? Who am I? Why am I here? What, all those cliche kind of questions, which I find that has taken me a lifetime to answer before I can use a tool. It's just like surgery, I mean, 14 years training in surgery, and we are trained how not to do it before we do it. And so how important was it for yourself to know yourself first before you can get this tool out and help others? Which I think is a critical point, because people are just going on and on about mindfulness, and it helps and take breathing. But I don't know who the hell I am, and what am I doing here, and what is my purpose in life, and how do I measure this thing at the end of it? So is there a personal window that needs to be opened first before we touch this tool? Am I making sense in my question?
Yeah, you are. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the importance of practicing mindfulness before we try to teach it or use it with other people is crucial.
Okay.
So this is a practice that we really only learn by doing it. And despite being an author and a speaker on the subject, I always say to people, you can listen to me all day, but you will not learn this until you have practiced mindfulness in a formal sense. And that takes some time. Having said that, I think that one thing I've learned through mindfulness is that I don't need to pretend I can understand everything about myself. I'm a thinker. You know, I was raised by a philosophy professor. My dad's a professor of philosophy. And so we were taught in my house at a very, very early age to think about everything. And some of the faith traditions I've participated in have been very cognitive faith traditions. And what I learned through mindfulness is that that was really tripping me up. That was not helpful. It was that was actually not the most life-giving way for me to relate to God or to myself, to think about it. And I think sometimes we hope or we wish that we could understand the meaning of life, that we could know ourselves deeply. And sure, it's important that we're all practicing self-awareness and learning about our patterns, understanding how our past has impacted our present, setting goals for the future. These are all sort of cognitive activities that help us to know ourselves. And the reality is that life is deeply mysterious, right? Like God is deeply mysterious. We serve a God who is so much bigger than our little minds can comprehend. We will never understand God until, I assume, face to face, we see him someday. I have a lot of questions at that point.
So do we all.
Yeah, right.
So do we all.
I mean, we're eager to learn, right?
Yeah.
But I can't pretend that on this side of heaven that I will fully grasp God's thoughts. We know Scripture says God's thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. And one of my favorite parts of Scripture is the book of Job, where all these friends show up and try to explain to Job, right, the meaning of life. This is who you are. These are your problems. Right. This is how you can fix them. It all sounds pretty rational when they lay it all out. And then God swoops in and says, who do you all think you are to think you can understand all this?
That's right.
Did you make the universe? Did you create these creatures and these landforms? And, there are chapters and chapters and chapters of God just saying, like, come on, you don't know what you're talking about.
That's right.
And there's something.
There's some humor in that,
Yeah. So to be kind of like corrected by God in that way, like let go. You can let it go. Just be creatures. God has made us to be creatures as part of this amazing universe. And we do not have to understand the universe. We don't have to understand ourselves in the universe. Those are fun exercises for us. But I think mindfulness has given me this option of letting go of trying to figure every single thing out. It's taught me that there's a different way to relate to the world besides thinking about it. And if there's emotional distress there, one of the best things we can do is notice how our thinking and analysis and interpretation is actually triggering that emotional distress, and seeing if there are ways to let that go and instead to be in the moment in our experience in a different way besides thinking about it. So that's a long answer to your question.
But it's brilliant because it takes me, life is so relational.
Yes.
And we are relational beings. And that's why he sent his son, because none of us can relate to him as a spirit. God is spirit. But he sent his son. And how has that knowledge of self and mindfulness brought you into a deeper relationship with God?
It's helped me to be present to God.
Okay.
Now, so to think about God can have its benefits, of course. We do need to have clear theology, and we need to have right theology within the realm of what we can understand as human beings. But that's different than our ultimate relationship with God, So if I'm in the same room as my husband, it's good for me to have accurate thoughts about him, but that's not a relationship, right? The relationship is actually being present to my husband in that room for us to have conversations. But also, in our closest relationships, some of that greatest intimacy comes from not talking, from just simply being present, right? Simply being in the same space together. So mindfulness has helped me do that with God, to just be present to God. I can go through a whole day easily not noticing God in the room with me. And yet God is always in the room with me, always, right? Like God never goes anywhere. He is literally right here where we are right now. But do I notice, right? Am I paying attention? And so with mindfulness, it's cluing me into the present moment. It's helping me to pay attention to my experience in the moment. And as a Christian, part of that is paying attention to God, being present. Now, that may or may not lead into a conversation with God, but either way, mindful awareness within a Christian perspective gives me this chance to notice, oh, God is right here, right now. How cool, right? Or some people find that a little bit terrifying, actually, to think God is right here, right now. Yeah, and all of that is true, right? It's cool and it's terrifying, but it's just the truth. God is actually with us right now. And so mindful awareness gives me a chance to connect with God by simply being together, to bring myself fully into that space where God already is, just there waiting for me to notice.
Yeah. You know, this... as we enter into knowing of His presence, there's also, as you rightly pointed out, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Mm-hmm. And when the Apostle Paul writes and says, in Him we live and move and have our being.
Yes.
The way I look at mindfulness is having the mind that is full of otherness. He is other than me. He's bigger. He's other. And I want to go into this area, of love. Let's say you're talking about mindfulness and love. How different is mindfulness from spiritual disciplines? When you're talking about prayer and spending time in a solemn state, the spiritual disciplines of Christian faith. Mm-hmm. Is mindfulness one of those disciplines? Or, because you made it very clear it's a tool, but it's not a kind of a discipline, is it?
It can be. I think Christians have the option to use mindfulness as a spiritual discipline. It doesn't have to be. So the term mindfulness is also a rather broad term. It's an ancient term. Every world religion through the course of history has had some way of focusing in on the present moment. So, Christians from, I should say, even before the time of Christ, people seeking God were talking about meditation and contemplation and learning to be silent, be still, and know I am God, right? There are all these exhortations in the Old Testament. And then in Jesus' life, all these examples of using silence and solitude as a spiritual discipline, Jesus retreating to mountaintops to pray alone. And then certainly in the Gospels and in Christian traditions since Christ, there are all these examples of learning to be present, learning to pay attention and show up for God. So in that sense, there's so much overlap there with how we talk about mindfulness in a contemporary sense now. Here in the United States, there's a big emphasis on mindfulness from a secular perspective that's really used as a mental health tool. So learning to manage our emotions and even reduce physical symptoms because of that connection with the mind and the body, using mindfulness to reduce suffering in our lives simply as a mental health tool. But having said that, because paying attention itself is a spiritual tool, if we want to use that word, it can be a spiritual discipline. We do have the option to incorporate spirituality into it. I always say that mindfulness in a secular sense, without any spiritual addition or religious significance, even in a secular sense, it's a very powerful tool. It may sound a little silly, but I like to use the example of brushing our teeth as a tool that's secular, right? Like everybody can brush their teeth and get benefit from that practice. Now, if a Christian brushes their teeth, they have this added option of going like, oh God, thank you. Thank you for this gift of dental hygiene, right? And then we can receive the gift with gratitude, and we can connect with God even through a simple hygiene practice like that. And so mindfulness is kind of like that. Anybody who practices mindfulness can benefit from it as a mental tool. It's a tool of mental hygiene. But when Christians come to the practice, they have this option to use it as a spiritual discipline as well. They have the opportunity to use it to connect with God and also to cultivate an awe about God's world. So you quoted that scripture about living and moving and having our being, like God is fully in these movements and this life and this being that we have. God has just saturated our world with himself. And so when we practice mindfulness and pay attention to our experience and pay attention to the world, as Christians, we find God in that. If I'm fully present to my own body, to my own mind, to the things that are around me, I will see God there because God has saturated this world with himself.
But this is pointedly taken because it means everything, that when you see him in the light of who he is.
Yeah.
And so how different would mindfulness be with prayer life?
Yeah, so prayer can mean so many things, I think, because communication can happen in so many ways, even between people. So when it comes to us communicating with God, there are verbal ways to communicate. There are nonverbal ways to communicate. There are types of being together that are prayer-like with God that don't really involve any intentional communication, just sort of being present. I would say in my own life, I found that mindfulness gives me a way to be in prayer with God, other than trying to think of lots of things to say to God. So while there are certainly lots of important things we do need to say to God, there's a really key role for repentance and confession, intercession for other people, praise, thanksgiving. These are all really beautiful and important ways to pray. But mindfulness gives me this opportunity of a more intimate kind of prayer with God that's really just sort of being together. And when I start to pay attention to the world through mindfulness, then I have an opportunity then to notice God's goodness. And that tends to stir up gratitude and awe inside of me in a way that can easily flow into prayer. So when we think about something like praying without ceasing, that we know that we can't literally go through the day talking to God all day. We can, as much as possible, work in those little conversations with God. Thank you for this. Please be with that person. I trust you to use this work I'm doing for your glory, right? Like these kinds of prayers are beautiful and can be inserted through the day. But mindfulness means paying attention to the present moment. So by as much as possible being present throughout the day, that allows me to be present with God throughout the day, which I see as prayer, right? It's presence is that, or prayer is that presence. It's that communication with God of simply being together in an intimate way.
And I think that the point of your book, cultivating a life of openness, because you go into a space of vulnerability that suddenly you realize that you're open to anything that's going to come your way. And we are mindful that he's always before you, that you can cross over and still stay firm, which is leading me to the point of the word resilience. Because I find that as you use this tool, like any tool, it will strengthen in some way your life as you move forward. So put us into this correct thinking of mindfulness and resilience, because both, one is feeding the other, and at the end of the day, the ground support of that fortress is resilience. How do I build resilience through mindfulness, that I can overcome all the pressures and the challenges of a day-to-day life?
Yep, and resilience is really the concept that life is stressful, and we want to be able to rebound when we fall down, right? We want to fall and get back up. So it has an element of toughness and grit to it, but not in an overly guarded sense, more with some vulnerability included, right? We can acknowledge that we fall down and we want to know what helps us get back up. I think there is a lot of overlap with this concept of God's judgment and grace. So we all know that we cannot stand before God pure and blameless, right? It's just not possible. We are born into a world of sin, and all of us, more than we would like, participate in sin. And so this is what I love about the gospel of Christ, is that God says, yeah, I know that. And here's grace, right? So God's not actually expecting us to be perfect. God is not expecting us to be blameless. God is saying, yeah, I know you can't do that. That's all right. I gotcha. You're covered, right? Like that was taken care of on the cross. You're good. Through my blood, you are redeemed. You are saved. That's a powerful message. And we know that as Christians, but I think it's hard for us not to just get stuck on the sin part. And on that can so easily morph into just being in a place of guilt or self-hatred, kind of an inner critic that gets really loud. And I don't think that's what God has to offer us. I think God says, yeah, I know it's hard to be a human being living in sin with sin. And you are fully loved and fully covered by my grace. So how does that fit into resilience? I think that resilience is being okay, being imperfect, and focusing more on how do we care for ourselves and get back on our feet when we fail, when we make mistakes, when we're in pain, when we're suffering. What are the practices that we are learning and cultivating that God has for us that can help us be well again? So in mindfulness, we talk about feelings and all of our experiences in the same way that we would talk about weather. So we know that weather changes all the time. Here in Michigan, where I live, it's hot in the summers and it's cold in the winters. And so sometimes we have snow, sometimes we have rain, sometimes it's sunny and delightful. And this is the same around the world, right? The patterns are different, but we are all familiar with the unpredictability of weather. And so we know that with our emotions, there's a similar unpredictability. That sometimes we feel sad or angry or embarrassed or jealous. And the list could go on and on, right? Anxious, stressed. And this is normal. This is normal that our minds and our emotions and even our physical experiences are in constant flux. And so mindfulness allows us to see that as a normal part of the human experience. And so when we are struggling, it doesn't mean that we have failed, or when we have failed at something we intended to do, it doesn't mean that all is lost, right? It means that this is an opportunity to begin again. This is an opportunity to start over. And we, as Christians, we can do that by going to God and saying, oh, can you help me start over, right? Like I messed this up. This isn't how I wanted it to go. Thank you for loving me anyway. I'd like to begin again. And we can do this with each other too. In the relationships that really matter to us, we all mess up at times. We all hurt one another without meaning to, or sometimes meaning to, and then realize we were off the mark, right? And so in any relationship that we want to last long term, we need this ability to start over and to say, I'm sorry, to say, can we begin this again? That's all mindfulness. And that's all resilience too, with ourselves being able to say, oh, that didn't go as I hoped it would. How can I begin again in this moment? How can I start over?
Well, thank you. I mean, you've teased that out very professionally, because these are the questions that we are toying with, or putting it in this right perspective. Talk to me about brain health. How do I keep my brain healthy, Irene?
Yeah. Well, we're more and more thinking about the brain as being part of the whole body.
Okay.
So we know the brain is up here in our head, but we also know that it's connected through our nervous system to every single part of our bodies and everything that we do. And I think we're more and more aware that we all come into the world with different brain challenges, you know, for lack of a better way to say it.
Right.
You would have more technical terms for this, but the reality is that we do not have the same brains. Every brain is different.
Yeah.
And so I think that, for one, that can give us a lot of compassion for ourselves and for one another when we're struggling. So somebody who's experienced a brain injury or a brain surgery, like what you're talking about, will have some differences moving forward that will simply be biological, connected to their brains. But, you know, Rick Hansen is a mindfulness professional who talks about the brain being in our head, in our heart, and in our belly.
Yes,
so he's sort of saying we want to look, we want to learn to notice that our brain isn't just our thoughts. It's not just the thinking part of ourselves up behind our eyes, up in our head. We want to learn to get out of our heads into the rest of our bodies. That's part of mindfulness practice. And that's part of good mental health as well, as learning to not just be swirling in our heads, but to notice our whole physical experience. And that is part of brain health. So allowing our thoughts, our attention, to focus on something besides just what's going on in our heads. And so when we do something in mindfulness, like paying attention to physical sensations on the bottoms of our feet or the tips of our fingers, or hearing the sounds in the space around us, or noticing shapes and colors around us, these are all practices that help move us out of our thoughts into a more direct experience of the world around us. That helps our brains be healthier. We know that through research, it's shown that mindfulness does lead to measurable changes in the brain. So we see more interconnectedness within our brain when we practice mindfulness. So there's better communication between the emotional center and the more rational centers of the brain. We see that there are changes in the proportion. So our amygdala, where those emotions are firing out of, that becomes a little bit smaller and more in balance with the rest of our brain. We find that just any activity that focuses our attention helps the networks in our brain to be less negative, right? So there's this tendency when our attention is wandering for that default mode network, it's called, in our brain, where we kind of by default, we start to fall into negativity and more depressed thinking and depressed emotions. When we focus our attention, we're quieting down that network so that our brain can take in the rest of the information. So there's lots of research out there, lots of science around it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when it comes to our experience moment to moment, we can know that anytime we're shifting out of our head into our body, out of our thoughts into a more direct experience of the present moment, that's going to have a long-term positive effect for our brain and for all the rest of us as well. So mindfulness helps us to notice ourselves as fully embodied beings, not just thinking brains,
Yes.
but also our brain being part of this holistic experience of who we are as human beings.
Excellent. I mean, so definitely mindfulness has a role to play in the emotional health of the brain in life.
Absolutely.
Because it makes you more stable and more grounded in your thoughts, and how your response is better than your reaction to something, because you're able to pull back and think carefully how you would respond. I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, listen, we've had quite a tour on the different aspects of mindfulness. How do you see going forward in this fractured world? The whole concept of having the mind of Christ. I'm sure it'll make us better Christians, healthier Christians in many ways. But at the same time, I think we're drawing us closer to God, because we are becoming mindful that He's in the center. Would you think so? I mean, it's important, right?
And I think that there's for Christians who are wanting to cultivate that mind of Christ, for me, step one is clearing out my own mind a little bit. And I don't mean clearing out in the sense of, sometimes we think that meditation means to clear our thoughts. And that's not what mindfulness meditation is. It's really not clearing out our thoughts, but it's more becoming more aware of what is in the mind. So if I want to be more open to Christ shaping my mind, I have to start by noticing what's in my mind. So if I'm going through the day, you mentioned that autopilot that so many of us are in for most of our lives, which is just pushing to the next thing, the next thing, the next thing.
Yes.
And that's, really kind of these automatic patterns we fall into, and we don't always pause to notice, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is my body experiencing? What are these connections with people around me like right now? So that type of awareness is step one in saying, okay, God, so here's what I have to offer. I kind of think of the boy with the loaves and the fish and the crowd, right? And coming to Jesus and saying, all right, I've got this little amount of food. And then Jesus does a miracle and makes the baskets and baskets of bread, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
So in a way, when we become aware of what's in our mind, we sort of say, okay, God, here's what I found. Here's what seems to be happening for me right now. Now I'm ready for your miracle, right? I'm ready for your mind to be growing within me. And even, Christianity is actually very radical when you think about some of the attitudes and the thoughts, things like loving your enemy. This is not natural, right?
Yeah, right. Show the other cheek,
Yeah, not natural. And so when we're in autopilot, our minds are full of these things that are not of God. When I'm in autopilot, I do not naturally love my neighbor, right?
Yes, right.
Like my neighbor who makes too much noise at night, or my neighbor that doesn't cut their grass, or whatever, right? These are not natural feelings in me. So I need to first notice my own thoughts and feelings and bring those to God so that my mind and my heart can be transformed. And I think that then we have the opportunity to receive the mind of Christ. God's always eager to help us with these things, right? Like he says, ask and you will receive. And I think these are the things that God is delighted for us to ask about, so I notice these thoughts as I practice mindfulness. Or even I notice these physical sensations that are very painful or uncomfortable. I'm not sure what to make of them. Or I notice these emotions that scare me or they're uncomfortable. And when we bring that to God and say, I would like your mind, I would like your presence in the midst of all this, God is actually quite eager to respond to those prayers with compassion and also with that transformation of the mind that's talked about in Romans, for us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And I love that word renewing.
I've got it right down here. You took it off my page,
Yeah, it's
Romans
such a great
12,
word.
verse 1 and 2, and, be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Right. And to me, that implies that we don't just sort of get a mind fix and then we're done for life. Right. It's more of this constant process of renewal. We're constantly being renewed. Many of us, you and I included, are doing very hard work in the world. We're working with people in really difficult situations. And many of us are going through very difficult situations personally, with families, with society, with politics. Like the world's a mess, right? And the world has always been a mess. This is not new. The world has always been a mess. Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. And this turns out to be true, right? It is true. We all have trouble. But fortunately, this renewal of the mind is always accessible for us. And I think that ties right back into that conversation about resilience. It's not that we expect smooth sailing through life. It's more that we're ready to continuously notice what's in the mind, open up our hands so we're not gripping onto our own thoughts and perceptions, open that up and say, God, please bring your renewal. I'm ready again. I'm ready again today. Ready again in this moment for this renewal so that we can then adopt the mind of Christ.
Irene, you have put a real mark on the word mindfulness, because now that it becomes a tool and it can be misused. So there will be dangers. There must be some dangers in mindfulness, like anything in life.
Yes.
And before I forget this question, but I want to take you, where do you think was the birth of mindfulness in the Christian faith? I mean, I look at it. Let me hear you first. Where do you think was that birth of mindfulness in the biblical worldview?
Well, I mean, I think the first place it shows up in Scripture is at the very beginning. You know, I think of God. Yeah,
I tell you, listen, I think I'm sitting on that chair next to you and behind you. You know, you really took it off my face, because there you go. Did God really say don't eat of this fruit? He was testing the mind, you know. So is that where you were going to?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of the garden there. I'm thinking of the way that, you know, God was asking Adam and Eve to be present with him, right? I love how he walked into the garden after the fruit was eaten. And he said, and he said, "Where are you?" We all know that he knew where Adam and Eve were, right? Like he had made them. But what an amazing question to say, you know, where are you? Because I think in a way that's what he's asking us to do, to notice where am I? Right? Like, let me actually notice, where am I right now? What is my experience in this moment? And anytime that we're hiding out, if we're hiding from God, as Adam and Eve were in that moment, that means we're not fully present to what's going on. We're not fully present to the gifts that God has for us. God has really good gifts for us. Yes. And he did right there at the beginning of creation, right? God created the universe and immediately said, "This is good." Yes. Like, look at this cool universe that I have created, right? That's right. And I think that is a really hard message for us to internalize and believe, that God's creation is really good, that we as God's creation are good. And that's not a non-Christian message, right? Like sometimes Christians think we're only allowed to talk about sin and depravity. Yes, the world is broken. And yes, sin is present, and God really loves his creation, right? Yes. Like from the very beginning, God said, "This is good." And so with something like mindfulness practice, when we pay attention to our own bodies, we're paying attention to God's creation. We're paying attention to the creation of the master. Yes. And just like, you know, we might go look at the Sistine Chapel and be amazed at Michelangelo and the creation, this masterpiece. This is us. We are the masterpiece of God, the creator. And so from the very beginning, God was letting us know, hey, I'm in this and I like this. I have made you, I have made this creation. And when you run off and hide from me, I'm going to call you back to pay attention to where you're at, right? Like, where are you? Yeah. Come out in the light and let's be present together right here.
Oh, beautifully put. I mean, that is. I'm just bathing in the words that you're saying, because it's like knitting, you know, a full picture and a tapestry of life with the word mindfulness written right across it, you know. And I mean, you know, the Jewish people, we have the Shema. Jesus was Jew, and he said, "Hear, O Israel." Mm-hmm. He calls to attention the whole discipline of listening. Mm-hmm. You know, he didn't give any other instruction. Listen here, like, pay attention.
Yeah.
The Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, strength. And those are the four faculties of resilience, because that's where you build your faith.
Yeah, it's a very holistic vision. Yeah. What? It's a very holistic vision. I love that. Yeah. So the thing that God is asking us to bring all of us to relate with him.
That's right. Well, that's a nice place to end.